con un PhD en ingeniería, que es un experto también a nivel mundial en biomimética. Ha ocupado posiciones académicas en la Universidad de Bristol, Cambridge y la Universidad Liberty en Estados Unidos. Ha trabajado para la Agencia Espacial Europea, European Space Agency, y fue el diseñador líder para los paneles solares del satélite espacial más grande del mundo, el Envisat. También lideró el diseño y prueba de la cadena de transmisión para el equipo olímpico de ciclismo de Inglaterra, el cual ganó un récord de 6 medallas de oros olímpicos en Río 16. Como resultado, fue invitado a exhibir este trabajo en la Royal Society, que es la Academia Nacional de Ciencias de Inglaterra, en el 2017. Ha recibido muchos premios a nivel nacional por sus diseños en ingeniería. Incluyen entre ellos la medalla de oro de Turner, la medalla a la ciencia de Wessex y el premio al diseño de Molin, el cual fue otorgado por el ministro del Estado para el Comercio y la Industria en Inglaterra. Es autor de libros como El sello del diseño, Él hizo las estrellas también, El diseño y los orígenes del hombre. Please give a warm welcome to our guest, Professor Stuart Burgess.
Thank you for your welcome. It's good to be here. It's a good university, very beautiful country. It's really good to be here, and I can see Mexicans are good at arguing. I think, but it's good to debate. I'm glad I don't understand Spanish, so I didn't hear the argument. But I think I will try to answer some of the questions. And the lady who was speaking said it is important to have critical thinking, and it is important to consider objective evidence, and it is important to consider science. And those are the very reasons I believe in a creator, because I believe in critical thinking and because I believe in science. I'm going to give you just a little bit about my background, because I've had about 40 years at the forefront of science, and these are the reasons I believe in a creator. And in my time at the forefront of science, I've met many other scientists, actually not just Christians, but some Muslims. I've been invited to Muslim countries to speak on creation. More and more scientists are believing in creation and are rejecting evolution. I'll explain some of the reasons why, but this is like a personal testimony. My main background is in designing spacecraft. This is a Skylark rocket. I designed the separation mechanism for this spacecraft. I designed the main deployment system on the biggest European spacecraft, the last one. This one was launched just a few months ago, a $1 billion spacecraft, launched from French Guiana, not so far from here. And one of the things that, I don't know any engineers here, but one of the things they don't teach you in a university is when the launch, when that spacecraft is on the launch pad, as it was last November in French Guiana, if you are the engineer who designed the spacecraft, you feel physically sick on the launch pad as the spacecraft is there. Because this spacecraft costs $1 billion, and if it doesn't work, it's a big problem. So design is a difficult thing, and it's because of that experience. That's one of the reasons I believe in a designer. I know how difficult design is.
Sir, what was the most important obstacle that you went through there?
It was this here. There was this on this spacecraft. So I designed this solar array here. It's the largest solar array on an Earth observation satellite. That solar array is the size of a badminton court. It's a really big solar array.
What does it do?
So the sun shines on here and it gives power to the whole satellite. And if the solar array doesn't deploy within 50 minutes of launch, then the whole mission is just dead. So it's a very critical operation.
Yes, but that you had to measure an angle there and calculate several calculations.
Yeah, this turns around during orbit, so it's always moving. So I had to design this gearbox, and I had to write out this equation. So I believe in predictive science. I believe in critical thinking. For 40 years, I've had to do nothing but critical thinking and predictive science, and do observations in the laboratory. This is some of the deployment calculations I did for the spacecraft. So this is some of my background. Another bit of my background is working for the British Olympic cycling team. In 2014, they had some problems with their bicycles, so they asked me, could I redesign their chain drive for the Rio Olympics in Brazil? They did not mind that I believed in biblical creation. All they are interested in is, does it work? And will this person design something that is successful? So they came to me. And so they said, could I do this for them? I said, if they give me an official Olympic tracksuit, then I will definitely do it for them. So a few tracksuits came the next day. Thank you. So what are the challenges? I asked them what they wanted. They said they wanted the fastest bike in the world to go 50 miles per hour on the flat. That is very fast if you're just travelling on the flat to go 50 miles an hour. So there's no pressure. They just wanted, just break all the world records. That was the target. The hardest thing actually was pleasing the Olympic riders because they are very fussy. When they're cycling the bicycle, if you change the most minute thing, they get really, they don't like anything to change. And the new chain that I put on the bicycle was very quiet. So they said, this chain is really quiet. The female riders thought it was too quiet. But the men said, if it's quiet, it's good, so we must have this chain. So I was very thankful to Bradley Wiggins, he's the famous. It was great to meet these famous people. Another challenge was the American team were also changing their chain drive. Now I don't know if there are any cyclists here, but you might notice the chain drive is on the other side of the bicycle. Normally, this is on the right-hand side, but they put it on the left-hand side. It's a really difficult thing to do, to make the whole bike the other way round. The reason they did it is that this is the inside of the track. So by putting it on the inside of the track, when they go round anti-clockwise, it goes through a shorter distance, by just a little shorter distance as they go round anti-clockwise. So they saved a fraction of a power. So this made it exciting. It was like the USA versus Great Britain in the optimizing the chain drive.
With the noise, what do you do? Do we do the friction or what?
Yeah, we reduced, I'll show you, we reduced the friction, and that's why it went so quiet. But this shows you that the kind of winning distance that you get, it's absolutely minute in the Olympics. So even changing the efficiency of the chain drive makes a big difference. So the main thing I did this invention. This is a completely novel invention, a way of measuring the efficiency of a chain drive. So here we have a pendulum, because I thought a pendulum is the most accurate system for measurement. So I stuck a bicycle drive onto a pendulum. And then when the pendulum is swinging, we monitor the decay with a laser. And depending on the friction in the chain, the pendulum goes a long time or a short time. So a very efficient chain, the pendulum just keeps going. But if it's not an efficient chain, then the pendulum comes to rest quite quickly. So this enabled us to measure, this was chosen as one of the top 21 scientific breakthroughs in the United Kingdom in 2017. This shows the real version in the lab, and we tested thousands and thousands of chains. But not only that, we changed one of the rules of cycling. Normally, you try and have the smallest sprockets to make them lighter, but we completely reversed that, and we made the sprockets very large. With the same gear ratio, but we maximized all of the sprockets, which was completely throwing away the old design rules. We also made them out of carbon fiber as well. That had not been done before. And for various reasons, this improved the efficiency, reduced the friction in the whole chain drive. We also changed the design of the chain. We had the Union Jack, so we knew which team that the chain belonged to. And through looking at some of the equations, we changed the geometry inside the chain. So again, this is applying critical thinking, predictions, objective science, observational science in the lab. That's what I believe in.
What sort of geometry you use in that?
I can't tell you.
However,
because you probably know some Americans.
However, I'm pretty sure I could improve that.
Yeah. So, when the Olympics came, I was actually in Spain at the time, and I was on the phone to my wife, and I was terrified again because the chains had only come a few weeks before the bikes got to Rio in Brazil. And we didn't know if they'd been made well, and the power of the riders, they can easily snap a chain. So I was terrified. The bikes were on live television and they were going to cycle these chains, and my wife was at home watching. I was in the Spanish Pyrenees, and on the phone I said, just tell me that the chains did not break, to my wife. And she went back and she said the first race has happened and they broke the world record for the ladies. So this was just fantastic. The first race, they broke the world record.
Why were you scared that the chain will drain if you had everything contemplated, like you said before, ahead of time?
Because you can't always trust the manufacturer, the way they assemble the parts. And engineers always...
Shouldn't you be there to check it out?
Yeah, but the chains did not break.
Okay.
The chains did not break.
Disculpe, ¿puede dejar de interrumpir la conferencia, por favor?
Okay.
So, the same day, they won gold in the sprint. The next day, they won gold in the pursuit. The men also broke the world record. The next day, they won gold in the women's pursuit, breaking the world record. And then they won 6 golds. It was the most golds ever for one team in one event, because this is only one cycling event in the whole Olympics. I don't know how many gold medals Mexico won in total. I think it's less than 6 in the whole Olympics. And just cycling...
It's not our sport.
This is just one sport, cycling. But the best thing was, Great Britain came first and the United States came second. So I like giving this talk in America. I explained to the American that they did very well in the Olympics. They won a lot of silver medals, but Britain won a lot of gold medals. And so this was on the national news in the United Kingdom. So I had a lot of interviews, and I was invited to exhibit this at the Royal Society. This is the top science exhibition in the United Kingdom. And I even had a thank you from a government minister. She's the Minister for the Treasury, and this person is like the finance minister in the United Kingdom. So I didn't get a gold medal, but I did get a thank you from from the government. So this is just a bit of my background, which is really important. If I just now... Because now I want to explain why I believe biblical creation is good science. And it is a personal testimony. I can't say that I can prove the Bible is right, but I believe it is a very, very reasonable faith. I can understand why the greatest scientists that ever lived, like Isaac Newton, Lord Kelvin, Michael Faraday, James Clerk Maxwell, the great scientists, I can understand why they believed in creation and they believed in the Bible, because I believe science supports the Bible. So I've really gone through this, but I have 40 years experience of designing. I have 25 years experience working in academia. And one of the most interesting things working in academia and working all around the world, I'm really surprised how many academics are sympathetic to intelligent design. I think the media give the wrong message. The media give the message that academics don't believe the Bible, that all the academics believe in evolution. That is just not true from my personal experience. And I have a lot of scientific publications, mainly the science of design, not just in engineering, but design in the natural world as well. So I have a professional interest in the design argument, because half of my papers relate to design in trees and animals and plants. And what I found in my experience are these myths. It is a myth that the Bible contradicts science. It's a myth, this idea that evolution is a fact. I have spoken to so many biologists in academia in my experience, and I've spoken to non-Christian biologists, and they said evolution is not a fact. It is a theory. We believe it by faith. But the media give the wrong message that evolution is a fact. It is not a fact. It is a theory. It's also a myth that Darwin saw evolution. Darwin never ever observed any evolution, and evolutionists will admit that. All he observed was adaptation. Adaptation is not evolution. It's also a myth that, I mentioned this already, it's a myth that academics just accept evolution, and it's also a myth that biblical creation is bad for science. So I'll explain some of these things. A really key thing, and I think this follows from Joe's talk, is that we all have a worldview. Biblical creation is a worldview, but at least it admits it is a worldview. Very often, atheism, evolution, does not acknowledge its worldview. Lord Kelvin, he is one of the greatest scientists that ever lived. If you're an engineer, he is the father of thermodynamics, and he believed biblical creation, he believed in a creator. He came after Charles Darwin, and he is one of the greatest scientists, and he would support everything I'm saying in this talk. And he said modern science must consider, you cannot just ignore a creator. So I'm really just agreeing with these great scientists. This is a really important quote. This was a key person in history who pushed evolution, and he said science must rule out creation. Right? This is bad science. It is bad science to say we cannot have God. That's bad science. That's not how you do science. That's not critical thinking. That is bad science. And just look at this quote. This is what scientists do today. Even if all the evidence points to a designer, we just ignore it. That's bad science. That's not critical thinking. That's prejudice. So these are worldviews. Atheism, evolution, is based on a worldview. It's not neutral science, and it's not critical thinking. I would say to believe in evolution, you have to reject critical thinking. And you just have to have your faith in evolution.
Actually, I think those are manifestations of prayer.
Okay. So, as Joe said, it is a battle of worldviews. One worldview against another. If you read a person like Richard Dawkins, he claims evolution is a fact, it's a fact, it's a fact, but he never justifies that assertion. He never explains why you should. Okay, here is another very famous scientist, Sir Ambrose Fleming. You may have studied Fleming's left-hand rule if you studied physics. He's a great scientist, educated at Cambridge. He came after Charles Darwin, and he rejected evolution. Sadly, the media don't quote these great scientists, greatest scientists that ever lived. And he said the whole point of evolution is to be anti-God. It's not science. It is not science. It is an atheistic worldview. So this isn't me saying it. This is a great scientist saying it, Sir Ambrose Fleming. Sadly, these days we now have scientists saying you are not allowed to teach creation in schools, you're not allowed to mention it in universities. My students come up to me and they say, why don't you talk more about your creation? I once gave a talk like this in my university, and one student invited the whole university, and 1,000 people turned up to my talk, and there was a riot in my university. Absolutely, it took 10 years for everything to calm down. And there were some people, they wanted me to be sacked, fired from my job. But interestingly, and there was an argument there was warfare between engineering and science. Engineering wanted to protect me, the science wanted me to be fired. And the dean of engineering, who was an atheist, he said he would defend me with his life. He said, why can't I have freedom of speech? If I believe in God, why can't I say that? And he said he would defend me to the death. So he said, science cannot touch my job. But lots of students came and they said, this is brilliant, we love an argument. Even those who didn't believe in the Bible, they said, why can't we have this more? Why do we have to have this banned? This is ridiculous. We want to have this debated in public. And lots of students today say that. Why does it have to be banned? A lot of the students also said, it appears that these evolutionists are defensive. They don't like their theory to be challenged, and I think they were correct with that. I once mentioned creation in my lectures, and the editor of a newspaper said, they then wrote to me and said, we hear that you mention your faith in a lecture, and this, you can't do that. You must not mention your faith in a lecture. But earlier, we had that video that Joe played of people attacking Christianity. So in the West today, you have a situation where you are allowed to attack Christianity, but you're not allowed to mention Christianity in a lecture. So it's very one-sided. But secondly, I want to mention, this now ties in with my previous slides. Biblical creation is based on, well, my belief is based on observational science. I don't need to mention that. So one of the areas I have worked on is studying the human knee joint. I've been studying this for about 20 years, and I've produced bio-inspired designs. From a mechanical point of view, the knee joint is an incredibly beautiful and elegant, sophisticated structure. If you could look inside your knees, you would see this rolling mechanism, and you would see this mechanism here. This guides your knees. So I have some Technic Lego here. This is a parallelogram mechanism, 4 bars and 4 pins. And if I invert that, you get an inverted 4-bar parallelogram mechanism. All mechanical engineers know that you cannot evolve that step by step. It's called an irreducible mechanism. That all has to be in place simultaneously. That is the kind of thing that cannot evolve step by step. And I have seen lots of these in the natural world, these linkage mechanisms. And I've debated that with evolutionists, and I've said, how could that evolve? And they say to me, they don't know. They have faith that one day someone might be able to explain to them. They also say they don't understand this because they don't have a master's in mechanical engineering. And one of the things that I've recommended in my talks around the world, I think biologists need to learn engineering. Because if biologists learn engineering, they will see how difficult it is for these things to supposedly come about by chance. I published a lot of papers on the knee joint, mainly in the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. So I'm not just giving a vague opinion. I have worked on this in the lab for the last 20 years. And one of the things I find frustrating, I can hear people like Richard Dawkins talking about the world is not designed. He has never done science in the lab. He's never designed anything. He hasn't even done biology science. He's never done observational science. All he's done is written these just so stories in books. I've also done a lot of work on the peacocks. Lovely to see the peacocks outside. The peacocks have an incredible beauty. They have what I call over-design, and the peacock made Charles Darwin feel sick because he could not think, how could you explain the beauty of a peacock? A peacock doesn't have to be that beautiful. In fact, the feathers are so big, it slows it down. It makes it easier for a predator to get to it. And I've written some books and papers on this, but biologists have a real problem with beauty in the natural world. Why should a peacock be beautiful? And I know there are theories of the female peahen, she has some kind of preference for beauty, but why should it be so beautiful? Why should it be mathematical beauty? And this is a big challenge to evolution. I've written papers on this as well. But in contrast, if you take, this is a really common picture, supposedly showing how humans have gradually evolved from an ape-like creature in the past. Now you might assume this is based on evidence. It is not based on any evidence at all. And here is a quote. I can't read this out to you because I can't read Spanish, but in this quote, you can see this is from an evolutionist who is making an admission. He admits it is not based on science. It's based on my imagination. There is no evidence for that picture. So sometimes you hear Christians, they don't believe in evidence and science. I would say it is often the other way around. It is evolution, which is not based on observational science. It's based on these imaginations and speculations. I believe in critical thinking and objective evidence. And adaptation. Charles Darwin, he saw the finches change in shape. That is adaptation. There's no new information. It's a shuffling of existing genes. The finches are still finches. At home, I have a beautiful chihuahua, for which I'm very thankful to Mexico for producing chihuahuas. It's a teacup chihuahua. It's a tiny chihuahua. It's possible to breed huge dogs and tiny dogs and fast dogs and slow dogs, but they are all dogs. All dogs. They all have a tail, they all bark, and they're lovely, cuddly creatures. But you can't change a dog into another kind of creature. These finches will always be finches. And so adaptation is not evidence for evolution. It's a little bit like a car changing colour or changing size. It's still a car. The same goes for the pepper moth, if you've heard them. Even viruses, of course viruses adapt, but they're still viruses. They're not changing into another kind of creature. And no one has observed new information or new kind. Evolution has never been observed. Adaptation has been observed, but evolution has never been observed. If you look in a textbook, and you say, okay, what is the best example of evolution? If there are millions of examples of evolution, let's look at the best. The best example, the giraffe's neck. So, can evolution explain how the giraffe's neck evolved? The answer is no. It's never, ever been done. And let me explain. The giraffe's neck has some incredible engineering. It has this metae mirabile, this arrangement of veins, and it also has lots of valves in this amazing plumbing in the neck. So that if the head of a giraffe goes down, there's the danger, the blood pressure is so high, it could kill the brain. But when the head comes up very high, there's the danger the blood drains away and it could die. But this plumbing, these network of veins and the valves regulate the blood flow, and it's unique in the giraffe. Does any evolutionist know how this could come about? Well, I looked up a paper in the top journal in the world, the journal Nature. And if you look up this paper, 2016, and we know that mutations lead to deformity. Mutations are mistakes in the genes. So if evolution was to ever work, it would have to rely on these mutations, these mistakes. And no one has ever observed mutations that lead to a better design. Sometimes it's a neutral change, but it's not a better change. If I just give an example with my gearbox, this is the main gear. I have thousands of pieces of information to design my gearbox. If I made a mistake, the gearbox is not going to improve. It's going to get worse. It may not be very much worse, it might be catastrophic. But mistakes don't make things better. If you were getting on an aeroplane in your airport and someone said they put the wrong component in the engine, but don't worry, it might possibly be better, you would not get on the aeroplane. Mistakes don't make better systems. But then thirdly, we have this, I don't know if you've heard the sorry.
Question.
Yeah.
Second point.
Yeah,
so in other words, you're saying that evolution doesn't exist? Just like that?
No.
Sorry, I'm
You're
saying...
rejecting altogether evolution?
Yes.
Yes.
But I'm accepting adaptation. So things change a lot. So adaptation is a fact. Darwin's finches are a fact. So we could get taller, shorter, bigger. Our brains could grow. We could change, but we will always be human beings. And
so what about this image, iconic image of ape towards...
sorry, yeah, good question, yeah. So what I believe is that if you look at these old fossils, all of them are either human or ape-like creatures. And there have been lots of different extinct types of apes. So to give you a concrete example, have you heard of the Neanderthal man? So 30 years ago, he was said to be an intermediate form, but over the last 30 years, the evolutionist has completely changed their story, and they now say he is 100% human, because he was upright, he plays the flute, was just 100% human. And I would...
That's one way to look at it, but that's not it.
Yeah, okay, but I would argue that if you show me any fossil, they either go into completely ape-like, or this is what I'm arguing, or completely human-like. And humans vary a lot in the way we look and our height. I can't prove this, but that is my...
So final comment, what about time? Is that Genesis 3,000 years ago, or do you accept the Earth's history of 4,000 millions of years?
Can I come to that at the end?
Yeah,
this is a big
we have a time reserved for
Yeah.
questions, so
Yes,
we can
yes.
ask around.
It's a good question.
Yeah, we have a time for that at the end. So
So I'll try and go through quickly. But you may have heard of the objection, the God of the gaps. Christians believe in a God of the gap. If there's a gap, you just say God did it. I don't believe in. I don't have to explain that. But I would say that is not fair, because Christians do believe in finding answers to those things. And I mentioned earlier, Isaac Newton, a very great scientist who believed in a creator, believed in the Bible, and he said he looked at the design of the universe, and he didn't believe in a God of the gap. I believe in a God who must have designed this universe that looks designed. So Christians don't have blind faith. Christians believe by the evidence that they see. In Mexico, you have some incredibly beautiful trees. I love the purple blossom on the trees. In Europe, we don't have anything like that purple blossom. So I don't believe by blind faith, and I don't believe in God of the gaps. I would argue that evolution is the God of the gaps. How did life come from a chemical soup? Evolution did it. That's not an explanation. That's a God of the gaps. No evolutionist can tell you how life sprung from a chemical soup. So that's God of the gaps. And where did humans come from? Where did the universe come from? Evolution did it, evolution did it, evolution did it. That's God of the gaps. Richard Dawkins, if you ask him, how did life come from a chemical soup? He'll say, well, by some process that I don't understand, and at some time which I don't know when, and I don't know how it happened, but it would have been a kind of thing that would have been. So he has no idea where life came from. And this is an important slide now, because in my time in academia, the last 25 years, I could speak to a world-famous biologist. I'm going to mention 3 very, very senior biologists, full professors of biology, places like Duke University, Bristol University, and they will say to me in private, evolution is probably rubbish. Biologists, a famous biologist, but they will not say that to the press because they will be fired, they will be demoted, they know what the consequences will be, but they tell me in private. So biologists don't believe it themselves. If you think biologists have confidence in evolution, you're wrong. They don't have confidence in evolution. This guy, when he retired, he went public and he wrote the foreword to one of my books, and he said the whole point of evolution is to support atheism. He was head of microbiology at Bristol, a place as good as your university. Imagine the head of microbiology at this university saying evolution is rubbish. Imagine what would happen. Well, that did happen at Bristol. There's another professor of microbiology. This person is not a Christian. And he said to me, evolution is like a magic wand. If you can't explain something, you wave a wand and say, evolution did it. So he could see it's evolution, which is God of the gaps. And another professor, a world-famous professor in virus research, and I always wanted to ask him, what do you think of abiogenesis? The idea that life could come from a chemical soup. And he said, it's like black magic. It's rubbish. It's just rubbish. If you were to go to a top biologist and say, what do you think of the idea that life could come from a chemical soup? And they'll tell you, it's rubbish.
That's
rubbish.
Because they don't have the answers.
But if you go to a junior biologist, they'll say, oh, it's easy because the professors have told me it can happen. But if you go to the top professors, they say they haven't got a clue how it could happen. They've been trying for 80 years with all these experiments, and they cannot make it happen. So it's been so interesting for me inside academia to see what people actually think about these things. And then this is a strong point of biblical creation. It's good at explaining the first beginnings. The first, when students come to my university, the first thing I teach engineers is the first law of thermodynamics, because when you're designing something, you have to add up what goes in and what comes out. So there's the conservation of energy and matter. But according to this principle, you cannot have a universe unless an almighty God put it there in the first place. You cannot explain matter and energy without an original creator. Just to say it came out of nothing, that's not science to do that. So creation is strong at that. And when you see the complexity of a cell, the incredible things that go on at the micro level, it just screams design. I've often spoke with biologists who say, design is the elephant in a room. You go to these biology conferences and you're not allowed to mention design. But everyone can see it, and you're not allowed to talk about it. And I've heard instances where people say, doesn't that look as though that's designed? Shut up, you're not allowed to talk about that. It's the elephant in the room. Did you know that the simplest cell, the simplest living life known, has 580,000 base pairs of information? That is the simplest life No, there is no such thing as simple life. There's no such thing. And you can't chop it in four and make something simpler. There's no such thing as simple life. All life is complicated. Another quote from Lord Kelvin, the very famous scientist, and in 1903 he said, it's just absurd to think life could just pop out of a chemical soup. And at that point he didn't know how complicated life is, because they didn't have the microscopes that we have today. And I agree with him. Bill Nye in the United States, he said, you know, believing in the Bible, biblical creation, that would be bad for science. But I disagree with that. In fact, I think the opposite is the case. I would never have looked at the knee joint if I didn't believe in a great creator who was doing great things. My belief in biblical creation has made me a better engineer, has made me a more successful engineer. And I have other colleagues in the United Kingdom. Andy McIntosh believes what I believe in biblical creation. He was inspired to look at the bombardier beetle, and he won some national awards for his work on that. And he did it because he believes in biblical creation. Raymond Damadian, one of the inventors of the microwave imaging machine, he was inspired by his biblical creation. So it's a myth, this idea that creation is bad for science. And I've mentioned some of these before, but some of the greatest, most of the greatest scientists that ever lived were inspired by their belief in God and creation. Then number 6, this is an important thing, because you might have questions about, but how about supposed bad design in the natural world? You've probably heard about some of this. This is an important objection to answer. So for example, there is the question of the eye. Richard Dawkins and others claim that the eye is wired backwards. Why do they say that? Because they say light comes into the eye and it goes through the retina at the back. So this is the retina here, and they say light has to go through the back of the retina to reach these cells right at the back. And so this must be a bad design. Richard Dawkins just makes an assumption. I think I know how the eye works. That must be bad. But of course Richard Dawkins doesn't understand design. He doesn't understand optics. And what he missed was there are these fiber optic cells, better than engineered fiber optic cells. So the light does not get degraded as it goes through the retina. It gets guided through thousands of fiber optic cells. So the light does not degrade. In fact, it improves because those fiber optic cells cut out the reflected light and actually do other signal conditioning. And engineers are trying to copy this feature in the human eye. It's a brilliant design which Richard Dawkins got catastrophically wrong. And today, evolutionists are still incorrectly quoting this as bad design. It's not bad design at all. Evolutionists often say the back is a bad design because we get bad backache. I disagree. The back is a very good design. Often we have a bad lifestyle, we sit down too much, or we have a disease, or we have a genetic inheritance, so it's not very nice if you have a bad back. But it's not, if you do have a bad back, it is not because it's inherently a bad design. It's due to other things. In my country, at Southampton University, they have a £1 million grant to improve bridge design based on the design of the human back. So at this very moment in time, engineers around the world are trying to make better bridges based on the human back. It's a good design. And this is my favourite one to explain to you, because this is the laryngeal nerve. It's become a little bit of a famous objection because Richard Dawkins has said this laryngeal nerve is a ridiculous detour. And in the United States, Jerry Coyne has said this is nature's worst design. So I can explain this to you. This is the larynx where we speak, and there's one nerve that comes to the top, but there's one nerve that comes all the way down and all the way up again. And so some people say this must be bad, because why do this big detour? Now this one is of really interest to me because I designed those spacecraft that I showed you earlier, because on the spacecraft I had to do the wiring, which was about 12 kilometers of wiring on those spacecraft. And basically this is all to do with wiring. Now when I look at that as someone who's been designing wiring for 30 years, I look at that and that is exactly what I would expect. As an expert in wiring, that's exactly what I would expect. Richard Dawkins, who has no expertise in anything, I would say, looks at that. He's a famous... yeah, sorry. He's famous in Europe and America. He tours the world promoting evolution and attacking Christianity. And so he's very famous, and he points to this laryngeal nerve as his main objection to believing in a creator. When I give lectures on wiring, one of the first things I tell my students is that loops are one of the most important things to a wiring engineer. If Dawkins had come to my first lecture, then he wouldn't have made this mistake. So I can explain this. This is from my spacecraft. These are 300 wires coming from the solar array, and I have two loops. So I have two loops, a loop here and a loop there. This is why I'm saying you expect to see loops. So why do I have the loops? One, because of intermediate connections. You can just make out a blue wire here, that's a thermocouple, and a red wire just here, that's a temperature sensor. And by doing this loop, they were able to piggyback on another wire. They couldn't go on their own, so I had to do a detour to get the other wires to that point. I also needed redundancy, so there's a system on this side, and there's another loop on the other side, in case one doesn't work. It also permits movement by not being too tight. And fourthly, there are assembly restrictions. And the point I want to make is that all four of those things relate to the laryngeal nerve. Do you see how there's an intermediate connection here? Those intermediate connections are just like mine. I have two here, and there are two here, one to the esophagus and one to the trachea. And these other things also apply. There's redundancy. So if a soldier gets shot in the throat here, his larynx still works because a nerve comes from underneath, and there are, it helps movement, and there also are assembly constraints as well. But as an expert in wiring, this is exactly what I would expect. So that is not bad design, it's good design. Joe already mentioned the appendix. Seventhly, the last point, interesting point, evolution has become intolerant. And I mentioned earlier that I've had some attacks, and the students find it very strange that we can't have a debate about these evidences. This is one of the books I've produced, Hallmarks of Design, and when those books came out, I had quite a lot of attacks. This was the front page in the United Kingdom, the Times, and it said, intelligent design creeps onto courses. So it's kind of assuming it must be a bad thing if you have intelligent design. And I saw one of my colleagues in my university, he was reading this newspaper, and I said, there must be someone in trouble. And he said, yeah, I think someone is in trouble. And I said, who is it? And he said, well, I can see your picture inside, so I think it's you. And then he said, it's been nice knowing you. But actually, I kept my job after that. Then I've also had attacks from this famous Richard Dawkins. He doesn't like me very much. But I've also had some attacks from atheist organizations. And in this email, they heard a student asked me what I believed in creation, so I told them. And then I had these emails saying, how dare I speak to a student about design, even though I'm a world expert in design. I'm not supposed to speak to my students about design. They are really worried and angry that anyone could be speaking to a student about design. And one of the difficult things is they talk about the next stage, but they didn't tell me what the next stage was, abduction or assassination or something. It's funny now, but at the time it's quite worrying when you get these emails. So the conclusion is, evolution is a world view. It's not neutral science. It has an agenda. It is a world view. And I quote one verse from the Bible, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." If Isaac Newton, the great scientists, were here, they would quote that verse as well. The atheist hasn't shown there is no God. They've just said, assumed there is no God. And I think it is important that we do have critical thinking. As I say, my belief in a creator comes from my love of critical thinking and my love of observational science. I'm not saying I've proved anything. I believe by faith, but I believe it is a reasonable faith. And I believe some of the attacks that are happening today show that scientists don't have confidence in evolution. They don't want to be questioned. They just want to shut down the debate. And I think that shows the whole weakness in evolution and the whole weakness in the atheistic agenda. So I hope that's helpful to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We will now begin our Q&A time. We kindly ask our audience to raise their hands if there is any questions. Also, we would greatly appreciate if you can ask one question at a time so that there is enough opportunity for all to participate. If you have more than one question, we will come back to you at a later time. We would recommend that you ask your question in English. However, if you need any help with translation, please let us know.